So I'm a co-founder of Fjord and Chief Client Officer there. Fjord is the design and innovation part of Accenture. I founded the company together with a couple of colleagues here in London, and I founded it almost 20 years ago, and we sold our business to Accenture Interactive about 5.5 years ago, and have since blossomed within there. We're now 1,000 designers worldwide. We have 28 studios. Our first studio, as I said, was here in London. So I'm going to kick off today by talking about our perspective on what is happening in digital, particularly with a focus on design and innovation, and where we think it's going, and what are the key things we think that businesses are beginning to focus on. In fact, I can say with some certainty some of the things that businesses are beginning to focus on. And we call that living business, and I'll come back to that. So I'm going to cover three things. I'm going to talk about digital disruption, or what's happening there, and some patterns that we see. Then the human implications of that, which are deeply important if we're going to think about CX. And then the business implications that come out of what's happening with the shifts in expectations around design and around technology. So when we look at the digital disruption, we see this immense pace of creation going on at the moment. In what is now, I think, a notorious quote, one of the editors of The Economist, actually a couple of years ago now, said, the pace of change will never again be as slow as it is today, which is a wonderful formulation in English. And I think that everything that is happening bears that out. We are just seeing this extraordinary shift. This chap, George, how many people know who George is or have seen him? He's quite well known. Almost no one. Okay, good. So I can. That's good, because it means I can say almost anything about him. George is in America. He's a hacker. So he has basically created a $1,000 hack where you can hack your vehicle and turn it into an autonomous vehicle, providing you've got the right kit meaning cameras, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying this is coming to market tomorrow, but what's interesting is it took Elon and his mates thousands of man-years to get to this point, and this bloke in 2 years has created a hackable car which allows you to turn it into an autonomous vehicle. In fact, he's now getting job offers from all over the place to go and work for people like Google and Tesla, unsurprisingly. But the point is that somebody on his own can now create something which almost passes for an autonomous vehicle, not quite, and it's not going on the roads anytime soon. And that compares with the amount of time that's gone into thinking about and creating autonomous vehicles over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's an extraordinary shift, and I think George is emblematic of that. And actually, I'd go further. We go further, and we talk about the fact that we can more or less now make anything you can imagine. And none of it is surprising to our children. I call them the Harry Potter generation, because they grew up watching movies about magic, and they actually believe that technology can bring anything into play. And I don't know about you, but when I go home and talk to my children about some of the things we're doing, which I regard as being quite miraculous, they're not surprised by anything. And they're not surprised not because they're ill-educated, but because actually the environment they're in suggests that we can now make anything we imagine. You know, on the left here, we have two people having a conversation over Google Assistant, where Google Assistant comes in and actually offers help and advice and becomes a third party in the conversation. So we're now having mediated conversations where there's artificial intelligence helping us with those conversations. We can create data visualizations for stuff we simply couldn't see before, what I call making the invisible visible, which is a key trend of what's going on in digital at the moment. And lastly, we have people being able to do things with robotics, often remotely, in surgical environments, again, none of which looked even remotely possible 10 to 15 years ago. So why is this happening? It's cost. It's fundamentally cost. A lot of the technologies have been around for a while. Some of them, of course, are developing at light speed right now, particularly machine learning. But a lot of this is actually about cost coming down. And the cost is coming down right the way across the patch in almost every kind of technology that you look at. What is happening as a result of that is two kinds of disruption. And we think it's too easy to get focused on the disruption on the, as you're looking at it, left, which is the infamous disruption. This is the thing that drove Kodak out of business in next to no time at all, because even though they had digital cameras, they didn't actually think it was going to be particularly big, and they got it horribly wrong. This is the thing which upended media more than 20 years ago now, gosh. in the mid-90s and has continued to create serious disruption and difficulties, particularly for the print industry. So those things they're interesting to talk about. They're glamorous stories, if you like, because there's an epic nature to them. It all happens so swiftly. But they're not actually the main disruption. The main disruption, which is happening to most industries, is compressive disruption. And this is where bits of your industry are getting nibbled away at by people who are coming in and doing bits of experience better than you've actually done experiences before. And I'll talk about them. I'm going to keep a track on banks all the way through this because they're they're not an easy target to talk about, but they're an easy example to use. Banks are a very good example of this. They're beginning to suffer from the fintech sector very severe compressive disruption because people are coming in and doing things just a little bit better than the bank did. How many people have a Monzo account or a Monzo card? Okay, good. Okay, so some people. So I don't know if, like me, you spotted. For me, my favorite thing of Monzo, it's super simple, are the maps. Monzo is a fintech, by the way. It started as a prepaid debit card, and it's now more or less a fully fledged bank. It's based here in the UK. On the Monzo app, when you go and look at any particular purchase that you've made, there is an immediate link to the Google Maps API, and a map comes up showing you where you made the purchase. It's genius. It's so far in advance of anything any bank has done, and yet it's so easy to do. Why is that genius? Because it gives you a rational and emotional benefit. The rational benefit is that when I look at that 800 euros I spent at some time over the last 3 months, which I've forgotten about and has rendered me in overdraft, and I don't know where it was, the map tells me instantly what it was. Oh yes, I remember that. I was in Italy. I foolishly spent £800 on some skis at the end of season because I thought it would be a good idea. But I see the map, and then I get the emotional benefit. Oh yes, those skis. I feel good about that. All of this, all wrapped up into a bank statement. 20 years ago, bank statements were bits of paper that you received once a month, which told you how poor you were 3 days ago. Now, banks, not just Monzo, are delivering you an app on your phone which tells you how poor you are right now. That's actually a big advance, but it's also compressive disruption because people like Monzo are coming along and they're doing that statement thing. It's not really a statement anymore, just a lot better than or a little bit better than the bank was, and they're winning hearts and minds by doing so. And actually, that goes to the heart of, the compressive disruption is attacking a lot of industries now. When I look at the businesses that have been looking to us at Fjord for design over the last 20 years or so, largely in the early days, it was media and CMT. Round about 2009, banks began to sort of say, look, we need to take this whole thing about customer experience seriously. Now, it's actually easier to say, well, it's all industries, rather than try and say which industries are talking to us. It's utilities, it's healthcare, it's pharmaceuticals, it's government, local and national. It's all kinds of different organizations. All of them are saying, we get this and we understand. And there's a subtle point on here I want to bring to your attention, which is that the shift from 0.51 to 0.57 in terms of the degree of disruption in the future. What that is suggesting exactly backs up what I said at the beginning of the presentation, which is that the pace of change is accelerating and the pace of disruption is accelerating as a result. Now, there are some big human implications around this. So we're talking about this lightning fast acceleration we're seeing in the way in which technology is changing things. The problem is we don't change so quickly. We can't suddenly grow new limbs or new senses, although, of course, there are, in fact, you can find videos of people online who are developing new limbs for humans, but they'll take a while to get there, and it takes a while. But we just can't evolve that quickly. And you need to create a bridge between the technology and people for them to understand exactly what it is that they're doing. We do adopt technology quite quickly. I remember, I'm sure many people in the audience will as well, here in London, it's my favorite example of rapid mass technology adoption was the Oyster card. So one moment, the Oyster card, I grew up in London, one moment the Oyster card wasn't there and hadn't been for years, and the tube was what it was. And the next moment there were Oyster cards. And it was literally, I swear, a matter of 2 years before you looked like you were pretty stupid if you were standing fiddling with a, with a ticket trying to put it in and you didn't have an Oyster card. That literally just took 2 years. So we adopt the technology very quickly. The problem is we don't actually adapt to technology very quickly. So if you think about all the things that are happening, so a lot of the narrative discourse happening in the media at the moment, particularly, for example, around overuse of screen time, this is something which even Apple are responding to, or particularly around overuse of social media amongst teenagers, for example, leading to depression, anxiety, and suicide. And yes, there are stats to prove all of what I've just said. We're now actually entering an era where we're beginning to focus not on the technology, not even on the adoption of the technology, but on the speed at which we can adapt to the technology. And this is true both at an individual level. I spend too much time looking at my phone, and I know I do. To the family level, my kids do, and we're having like many families, there's a constant dynamic in the family to what happens at an organizational level. Because I'm going to come back to this point, it's an important one to come back to at the end, that organizations are struggling to adapt to the pace of change of technology. And that, I think, is an existential issue for most of us in this room. Because people aren't rational. We're just beginning to get to the end of the rational economics era, where economists try to predict things based on rational behavior, but we're not rational. And when we go about designing customer experiences, trying to pretend that people are rational human beings, when they have a whole lot of messy things going on in their lives which distract them, when they have a whole lot of things going on in the back of their heads which you can't possibly detect using any kind of, at the moment, any kind of artificial intelligence or voice detection or any of the other technologies which are beginning to do some of this. All of this means that we're dealing with actually with a very high degree of unpredictability amongst people. And we're very, very sociable as well. So right now, and the power of our sociability is showing up. If you look, how many people know who that is on the left? Gosh, we do have a... You were absolutely right about the age of the room. So, you know who it is. Thank you. So, sorry? From New York. You're from New York. Okay, cool. And to be fair, I took this from an American colleague as well. So this is Cardi B. Cardi B is the first female rapper to reach #1 since Lauryn Hill back in 1998, I think. So she's making a massive splash. She's getting there. She's largely used Instagram to get there. So social media, go and have a look at the stories about it, but social media have been totally integrated into what she's done. On the right-hand side, does anyone know what that is, apart from being luggage? Can anyone guess the brand? Yes? Away. Yeah. So this is a brand called Away, and I had not heard of this until about 3 weeks ago either, like most people in the room. This is by far and away the fastest growing luggage system in the world right now that you have never heard of, but it is moving very fast and creating real waves in the luggage area. Now, I love this because who would have thought that luggage needed reinventing? But Away have come along and they've reinvented the whole thing, the product, the purchase process, etc. And what have they done? They put a massive focus on Instagram. In America, in their retail stores, they've actually created deliberately Instagrammable stores so you can go in and pose with your luggage in front of views of the places you'd like to go to with the luggage. It's really clever. And Instagram is driving their business because cultural currency is driven by how sociable we are as human beings. So it's because humans are have to be at the center of everything that we do, that so many of the startups that have been successful, some of the more legendary ones recently, are experience-led, and 2 out of these 3 were actually founded by designers. These are organizations with a strong focus on the human and their individual quirks and foibles. And I think it's hard not to have Spotify as a favorite if you use Spotify a lot, but Spotify is just a fantastic example of that because the way in which they just keep finding ways to show you music that you didn't know about. People used to worry, I think, before Spotify came along, when people were anticipating this, that we would move into an era where there was no, what's the word for happy accident? I've forgotten it, it's gone out of my head. Serendipity, thank you, where there was no serendipity. But actually, I think that what Spotify does brilliantly is they elegantly introduce serendipity into the things that they do, as well as finding you different ways to explore new music. I mean, I'm never short of new things to find on Spotify, all because there's a deep human focus. All of this, the context for this, is something we call liquid expectations. So liquid expectations are the fact that banks are no longer competing with their direct rivals. They think they are, but they're not. Well, they don't think they are. Many of the banks realize that they're not. They're not even competing with some of the startups like Monzo that I talked about earlier, who have come along and taken one thing, mortgages, savings, loans, payments, and focused on being super good on the human experience around those things. They're actually competing with best of experience right the way across the market. So one of the things that I think that was most remarkable about Uber was that when they did what they did, they shifted our expectations around payments full stop. So the first time you got in an Uber cab and got out of it, and I did this in London and maybe you did as well, I walked away from it and I found it really socially distressing because I didn't know whether I could walk away from the car or not, and how do you do this? This is a new form of behavior. The second time it was a little bit easier, and the third time I forgot about it and walked away from the taxi without any trouble at all. What's happening is that they have set a new expectation in my head, which is, oh my God, why aren't all payments like this? And now when I have to fumble for change in my pocket, why would I have to do that? And if you're lucky enough, and I was lucky enough to go in the middle of the summer to Amazon's Go store in Seattle, you'll see exactly the same thing. They've eliminated physical payment entirely from the store. You download a skinny app before you walk in. It takes about 8 seconds. You walk in, you literally walk around the store, put stuff in a bag, and you walk out. It's as simple as that. It's just extraordinary. And suddenly all other shops look pretty stupid by comparison. And one of my colleagues said, I don't think Amazon are going to scale that quickly. But actually that technology is coming to a German domestic technology vendor this next year. And Amazon are going to scale this very quickly. So what is happening with these things is that our expectations are changing. And unfortunately, the chasm between what we expect, what we are getting from more mainstream companies and the expectations of consumers is getting wider as more companies come along and begin to do things. And Amazon, unfortunately, we have to use them a lot as an example because they are, I think, in the lead at this at the moment. Amazon did it again with Alexa. They've just shifted expectations altogether. If I give you an example of that, my colleague in America, the one who knew about Cardi B, he was telling me that his son walked into their kitchen recently on a Sunday morning. He's 7, he's called Jaden. And he said, Alexa, put AA batteries on the shopping list. And he walked out again. So I love this story because you unpack it, there's a couple of things that happen in here. Firstly is, my friend Beju was not surprised by his son doing it. So within about a year and a half of a voice-driven device arising in the house, the family are no longer surprised by that behavior. Beju knew I would be surprised by it, but that's part one. But part two, which is even more troubling, is guess what arrived in the post the next morning from Amazon? Amazon Essentials batteries. Amazon Essentials batteries are now 93% of all batteries sold on Amazon. Because the expectations have changed. And Jaden is going to grow up with those expectations in his head, and this gap is widening. Where we are going now is something we call living services. So living services are the third era of digital, and they are starting now. The first era was desktop web. We can debate when it kicked off, 95, 96, 97, depends on who you are, what you were doing at the time. Second era was smartphone. Steve Jobs stood on a stage in San Francisco and kicked that off, 10 years ago? 10 or 11 years ago. And now we have this third era, living services. So we call them living services for a couple of very good reasons. First is they're not based on one technology, PC or smartphone. They're based on lots of technologies, all enabled by the cloud, by pretty much ubiquitous, decent bandwidth at relatively good prices. Like I said earlier, pricing is a very important point here. By the Internet of Things, increasingly by artificial intelligence. And they're living. They change in real time around us. Now, make no mistake, this is a massive shift. Websites were largely predicated on newspapers, which were static things that didn't change that much. Apps change a bit more. I can go and look right now to see how poor I am in my banking app. But where we're going is services that change in real time around our context and require data to do this. This is a big endeavor, but we're beginning to see examples of this break cover. So the earliest and best example I had in my head was Google, and many of you will have experienced this, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Stepping out of my studio here in London, actually a couple of years ago now, I set the phone to give me audio directions to a pub I wanted to go to on a Friday night to meet up with some old mates. And I didn't know this particular part of Marylebone, so I needed it. And it told me it was 17 minutes to go. So I start walking. I'm literally 2 meters outside the studio, and there's an alert on the phone. And the alert says, the pub will still be closed at the time you get there. That's a living service. It's very simple, difficult to achieve, but simple in conception and super useful. And we know where this goes next. So first point is, now actually these come via voice, as many of you will know, rather than being alerts on your phone. So they're even easier. You don't have to get the phone out and look at it, which I did that day 2 years ago. The second thing is it would have said, we know that you're meeting your 3 mates from school. Do you want us to tell them the pub is closed? And then the third thing, and you know where this is going, is it'll say, actually there's a pub that serves the same beer or the same kind of curry or whatever nearby. Would you like us to reroute everyone to that pub? That's a living service. And that's all within grasping reach right now. So you might be thinking, yeah, that's fine, that's Google, they seem to be able to do everything. It's not just Google. If you look at what banks are doing, if you study banks at all, where banks are going now is they're moving into this period, into this phase of not how poor are you now, to continue a theme I mentioned earlier, but we can actually detect how poor you're going to be in the future, and we can help you do something about that. We can offer you a loan, we can suggest saving schemes, we can suggest ways in which you might change your money, etc., etc. It's called predictive banking, and it's coming. It is definitely coming next year in several markets, and that will be a radical shift of banks, wholesale, into this era we call living services. But that's not easy. So there are implications behind this. So it's easy to stand on a stage and say the future is stuff that changes in real time based on data and context, and we're all just going to have these super jazzy, wonderful lives because the machines are going to let us. But actually, it's very difficult. You know, we're still mastering apps. We've spent 10 years doing that. In some cases, we're still mastering websites, and we've had 20 years to do that. So what's difficult about this is that we're talking about systems. We're not talking about individual points. We're talking about systemic things that we need to deliver to customers, or to put it another way around, things that we deliver to customers which will be very skinny and lightweight. And let's just pause there. One banking client told me that he has set his team an ambition, which is that in the future, if a customer has to go to the app to do something with the bank, they've failed the customer. I think that's an extraordinary vision. This is an organization saying, we actually want to be so powerful in the way in which we're able to execute that we don't want the customer to have to come to us. I think that's a very bold vision, and it's right to the heart of what I'm talking about here. But you need a system to be able to do that. And that system is not just an organizational system which spans the boundaries of your organization between the silos that you may probably do currently have, but it also needs to be able to play nicely with an ecosystem elsewhere. I mentioned Spotify earlier, and one of the reasons why Spotify is such a favorite for me is that they've atomized their brand. So you can get Spotify anywhere you can reasonably want it. You don't just get it as an app on your phone, you get it embedded in your car. You don't just get it embedded in your car, you get it on your Samsung Smart TV. You can get it embedded, you can get it through your Sonos home sound equipment. You can get it through Alexa for sure. You can get Spotify through Runkeeper, of all things, so that when you go running, you've got the music that you love. You can get it through Waze when you're in your car and you're not using the car system. So they're winning all ways round because actually they've cheerfully said, right, let's just atomize the brand and be there where the customer wants us when they need us. But this is also a systemic play, not just them being a system, but playing into a broader ecosystem. And all of that then is definitely pushing us to a place where the single biggest thing that we hear as a design organization from our clients right now is lack of confidence. Are we making the right big bets here? Are we using the right technology? Are we building the right things for our customers that are going to be more than fit for purpose, but actually delightful? Fit for purpose is no longer good enough. It's got to be delightful. Are we actually able, we have the ideas, so something we're hearing a lot from all sorts of organizations is we don't have a shortage of ideas. We've drunk the design thinking Kool-Aid. We've done innovation theater with sticky notes all over the walls. And by the way, I mean, we do innovation theater all the time, so I do know what I'm talking about on that. We've done all of that. We've got the ideas, but we can't seem to get the proof of concepts out the door. We've built minimum viable products, but they're getting stuck somewhere in the machine. This is causing probably more pain than inability to connect with customers, or perhaps putting this a different way around, because of these internal blockages in organizations, they're struggling to get out and actually connect with customers. So as you think about how do you create great customer experiences, designing for confidence is no longer about the stuff on the bottom side here, the things you might typically have asked your new product development people or your design people or your experience team to think about. It's also about the stuff on the top level. So it's not just create a product, you actually have to create a movement in order to get that product through the system, out the door, and into the market. And this actually, going back to a theme I've been trying to talk about so far, is very dependent on human insight. And that means asking the question, how do we deliver confidence? How are we giving confidence to customers and employees? If living services is the future and is actually the next era of digital, and all the signs are this is now really happening big time, then organizations need to become a living business. A living business is one which is actually able to change shape around the context of its customers and its employees in real time. That, again, is a very different construct in the same way as living services are a different construct from websites. We have to begin to imagine a shift from organization to organism, where the business is no longer constrained by organizational boundaries, which tend to provide a lot of rigidity. Rigidity was good in an era where what you wanted to do was chase efficiency all the time. But unfortunately, in this disruptive era, purely chasing efficiency no longer cuts it. You actually need to be hyper-relevant to customers in real time. And organizational structures tend to get massively in the way of doing that. And when we go out, and we have done, we've talked to over 1,000 C-level people worldwide, of which more than 10% were CEOs, and said, what do you think is most important at the moment? Brand relevance and needing to be hyper-relevant to customers was absolutely dominant in the thinking of the CEOs and the C-teams that we talked to. And in fact, what we've seen, and I'm going to show you a chart in a moment, in this research, we asked clients a series of questions about what are the things that you do in order to make your organization vital, to make it as flexible as it possibly can be, more like an organism, less like a traditional organization. And we then tracked their self-reported responses and mapped them against market valuation, profit and loss, revenue, and staff retention over the last 5 years. And what we saw was that businesses which scored highly in terms of their self-reported ability to flex around the customer and around employees were 50% more likely to survive disruption in their marketplaces. This is factual, this is not self-reported, and 3 times more likely to be growing than businesses that didn't. And they do this in, what we saw is that they'll typically be focusing on one, or maybe more, but usually one of 5 pathways to understanding how to grow. One is basically finding the new opportunities, so we call that targeting. The second is creating products and services which are hyper-relevant. The third is focusing on how do you get customer engagement. The fourth is how do you scale. And the fifth, and probably the one which is least talked about, is how do you actually rewire the culture of the organization. Now, this is slightly complicated, this chart, but hopefully you can see it, but I wanted to pick it out because I think it's important. So if you bear with my narrative, I think hopefully you'll pick it out. On the right-hand side of the squiggly line, the right-hand side squiggly line are the very high performers, which were, I think, less than, were very high performers. On the left-hand side, you've got low performers, or everyone else, basically. And what I find interesting about this is if you pick out the peaks on the right-hand side, the three main peaks are companies that are doing this well are innovating compelling new experiences. They are acting on insights derived from advanced customer analytics. So they're doing living services. They're picking out the data and they're understanding the context of their customer. And right down at the bottom, they're rewiring the structure of their organization around a customer focus. And actually, I think I'm right in saying that that one scored highest of all. Now look at what the laggards are doing. The laggards are not, at the top, doing a wise pivot by pivoting growth strategies to profitable areas and funding that growth by optimizing costs elsewhere. They're simply not focused on that. The second thing they're not focused on, or they're focused on worse than the others, are collaboration with partners beyond traditional boundaries. So that whole ecosystem thing is eluding the poor performers, which is the majority of the market. And the third thing they're not doing is they're not focusing on a culture which fosters customer relevance. So we think that in order to unlock the power of this era we call living services, because the end goal here is to create relevance for the customer through these services that change in real time, is to rewire with people at the heart. And that means thinking about how do we create outstanding employee experiences? Because some of you may contend, well, does this matter that much when it comes to the customer? They'll go on buying the things that they bought from us. And that, a lot of organizations, I think, mentally are in that space. A powerful argument against that is that may well be the case, but will you be able to recruit the kind of graduates you want in your business in 3 or 5 years' time if you don't actually have great employee experiences? So that turns out that is a very, very important, and again, not often remarked on part of this. The second is to focus on customer centricity, and the third, as I've mentioned already, and very important is to find the right culture. So a living business is one which focuses on these signals which are all about vitality, which allow you to flex around the customer. So one way of looking at this, and this is just a lens for finding how your business is on a scale, if you like, of 1 to 100 in terms of it being vital, is to think about the business. If we're going to think about the business, I said earlier, I used the analogy that you're moving from organization to organism, then let's think about what do organisms have. So they have vital signs. They breathe, they perspire, they excrete, they have a heart rate, they do think, they have things which show they're living. So what are the equivalents for organizations? Very broadly, we think they cluster into 4 areas which are the vital signs of an organization. The personality, what is the thing in the middle of the organization that drives it? British Airways is the same as Virgin Atlantic, or they do the same thing, but we know they're definitely not the same companies. They deliver different experiences. And I wouldn't actually right now say better or worse, and I've flown with both. They're just different. Why are they different? Because the personality is different. Why is the personality different? Usually it's a combination of legacy, which is deeply held and difficult to shift, and the personality of the CEO. It normally comes down to those two things. Sometimes it's market circumstances as well, but usually personality drives out of those things. You then have the craft. How good are you at doing the things you do? Does your banking app actually deliver a picture of a map of where the transaction was, or does it not? Are you able to deliver seamlessly to the customer the things that they want when they want it? So craft is one of the vital signs. Actually, are you good at what you do? It's extraordinary how many businesses. I bought a new car recently. I'm not going to name the manufacturer. The experience was broken at every single point along the journey. It was quite shocking, actually, how poor it was. And the lease company behind the leasing division of this major auto manufacturer did not talk to the car bit, who did not talk to the dealer, and none of them talked to me. I could actually write a book about it, how badly broken it was, but it would be a very boring thing to do. So they got their craft wrong. You typically get the craft wrong because your instincts have gone awry. Instinct is my favorite on here because, again, it's the one least talked about. How does a business behave in its guts What are the ways in which it goes about thinking about promoting people, for example? How does it reward behaviors? One of my favorite examples was I was in a client's environment a while ago where we had had a set of designers for about 9 months, and they were doing great work. And I asked our lead, why does this place still look like, it was actually a bank, why does it still look like a bank and not look like a design studio, which was our mission? And she said, she whispered it to me because there were some clients nearby, the facilities guy won't let us stick anything on the walls. That's instinct. And it's a funny story, but think about all of those back office roles, HR, legal, compliance, facilities, who instinctively get in the way of change because nobody brought them along on the program, not because they're bad people, but because nobody actually said, this is what we're trying to do, and got them involved in the change program. And lastly, relationships. All of these are mediated through experiences. So you can identify all of these. It's actually not very difficult to do, to run a self-audit, to say, and these are some of the questions, to run a self-audit to say, if we look at our organization analytically, where are we on these things? And none of them are necessarily right or wrong. The question is, how do you balance your vital signs across the board so that your business is able to do the things which I earlier on pointed out you need to be able to do in order to become hyper-relevant? And plenty of companies are doing this. Plenty of companies are beginning to unlock and are working very hard on unlocking the ways in which they can become hyper-relevant. One of my favorite examples, because it's a short and easy story, is sorry to reference again, but Amazon, where Jeff Bezos has his famous empty chair. So the empty chair represents a customer, and every important meeting they have, he insists there's an empty chair in the room, which represents a customer in the room, so that organizationally, they don't forget about the primacy of the customer to that organization. I think it's a good idea probably for everyone. So, we think that being human-centric is the key to unlocking value in this era, and we can now really make anything that we want to, so the opportunities are unlimited. That's not the problem set that we have. The problem sets are largely human. Expectations are shifting very dynamically out there. Living services are beginning to arrive, and those living services will then create another expectation shift. Think about what, for example, predictive banking will do when people begin to understand how powerful that can be in their lives. Predictive health as well, for that matter. In order to respond to this, you need to understand at a deep level how capable is your business of being able to deliver hyper-relevancy into the marketplace. And that means you need to look hard, long and hard at your vital signs, and then choose at least one of the 5 paths that I talked about earlier: target, design, scale, rewire. Choose one of those and focus on creating change there, because you can't do all of it all at the same time. And if I was to put my money on it, I would say most organizations right now need to be focusing on rewire, because that's where the deep challenges exist in organizational culture and in organizational constructs, which are getting in the way of businesses being able to deliver real living services and thus relevancy to their customers in the market. Thank you very much.
Well, 1 or 2 minutes, yeah. Am I on? Yes. So, Mark, absolutely fabulous discussion. I had just a couple of questions.
Okay.
A lot of the examples you give are B2C, so the living services B2C. Are you seeing examples of living services in B2B as well? And what would they be?
Yes, definitely. So looking at, for example, energy companies who have a large part of what they do is B2B.
Right.
They're beginning to look very actively at particularly how they can use Internet of Things in order to understand the changes that are taking place in the context of their customers and then deliver better. And again, a lot of this is about more predictive
right.
Products and services to their business customers. That's a small example, but that's definitely. Does that meet the?
Yeah. That's a reasonable example. Yeah. The other one was, at what point do you think we'll get to, or we may not even arrive at, convenience versus creepy.
So the creepy thing is a big problem, and it isn't going to go away. I think that, again, I'm just skip to the example I was using all the way through in order to illustrate this, which is banking. You know, one of the problems with that is going to be definitely, and it's a hurdle that banks will have to get over, is the ability to actually say to a customer, look, judging by the pattern of your behaviors and the patterns of what we see elsewhere using aggregated data from other customers, the chances are you're going to have some financial problems. I mean, it's a fact, by the way, that half of all UK bank customers are only 2.5 weeks away from having no money at all.
So far.
It's not, but it's, so I think the need is there.
Yeah.
The challenge, and I can't give you a solution right now, but the challenge will be, how do we educate people to a place where they go, yes, actually, this is acceptable. Yeah. So I think springing surprises on people is not a good idea. But there is actually a whole book to be written about how we're going to cross that creepy chasm.
And maybe the youngsters who grow up with it are less worried about it.
I think there is a lot to be said for that.
Okay, cool. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Curtis, thank you very much.
Thank you.